Everyone could use a little more Warhammer, especially if it's free. So I wanted to try and make some really easy molds out of some pre-existing bits and Warhammer models I have, and see if I can make a bunch more. I'm going to start off with this cattail bit from a Cruel Boys kit. They're super cool, but you only get a couple, so I thought it would be a great starting point to try to make a mold out of it. The material that I'm using is Oyumaru. You might have heard of it more commonly referred to as blue stuff. This is the same thing, just sold and marketed by different companies. The only real difference seems to be that even though the one I have comes in lots of bluish hues, there's also reds and tons of other colors as well. This is a malleable material that becomes formable when placed in hot water, so I want to see if we can make some two-part molds out of it. I measured the amount of Oyumaru I need by just lining it up with the Warhammer part. I want it to be the same height and width as the original bit, but also making sure that it's deep enough to cover half of it. By basing the measurements on its hardened form, you'll guarantee that you have enough material once you start forming it over the shape. It's also important to think about how you want to position the bit or model in the material. You want to avoid any overhangs pressing directly into the Oyumaru, as you'll lose detail like this. You pretty much want to find its flattest view and press that. I get a container to hold my hot water and heat some up somewhere between 170 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, or roughly 80 degrees Celsius, and leave it in there for about 2 minutes, prodding it with a metal file to check how soft it is. Once it's nice and squishy, I remove it. It cools enough to the touch once it comes into contact with the air, but definitely use a heat-safe tool to remove it from the hot water, and please be careful. From here, I just embed my Warhammer bit into the soft Oyumaru, making sure I have a snug fit, and I'm covering half of the bit or model. Once it's embedded, you don't want to fuss with it too much, as this starts capturing detail right away, and if the Warhammer part wiggles at all, you might get some weirdness deeper in the mold. Once the first half of the mold is placed, I wait for it to thoroughly cool and harden, and repeat the steps for the final half. I press my soft Oyumaru onto the exposed Warhammer part, making sure I get full coverage and a tight fit, but making sure you're not pressing down too hard, as you want the walls of the mold to be a decent thickness so the mold isn't too weak. It also helps if you can sort of wrap or fit the one half into the other, creating some asymmetry, making it easier to figure out how the mold goes back together. Once the two halves are completely cooled down, I gently pull them apart to reveal the original bit inside and check out my mold. Everything looks good, so I'm going to move on to casting. For my molds, I'm going to be using Milliput. This is a two-part epoxy, meaning that there's two components that by themselves are soft, but when mixed together and given enough time, they harden and cure. Mine has been sitting around for a while, so it sort of looks like something out of Ren and Stimpy, but nevertheless, I take an equal amount of each part and thoroughly mix them together. You should be wearing gloves for this, like the label says, so definitely a do as I say, not as I do type of thing. Once they're totally mixed, I start putting it into my mold. I start with the deeper half, starting with just a little bit, making sure I get it into the deepest parts and the nooks and crannies, and then also place some into the other half and squish them together. I press, trying to get a nice fit and squeeze out any extra, making sure I line up the two halves correctly. After several hours have passed, I gently pull the halves apart and check out my new Milliput cattail. There's definitely been too much material placed in the mold, but overall I'm pretty stoked with how the mold creation has gone, so I move on to something a little more exciting and complicated. Giant rats. These are fun and unique older sculpts, and I think it'd be really nice to have a couple extras for terrain or base decorations. For these guys, I leave them on the sprue to help line up the mold and decide placement. Because they have staggered legs, the halves of the mold are going to have to reflect that, flowing in and out instead of remaining flat. I cut a larger piece of Oyumaru and place it in warm water, squishing the giant rat into it. Once it's placed in there, I poke and prod the mold, making sure there's a snug fit around the model and making sure that the legs aren't too recessed and trapped in the material. Once the first half is cooled, you can see that I have large chunks of excess Oyumaru. I take my X-Acto and remove these. Not only is it good to be economical since this material can be reused, but making these flat sections of the mold will make for areas in which the other half can easily wrap over, helping to create a more snug and easy to use mold. And this extra material was the perfect amount to make a second mold of one of the smaller rats along the sprue, working out pretty perfectly. When it came time to add milliput to my rat molds, I was very conscious of making sure I added enough into the recesses, paying special attention to that front leg deep in the mold, and other similar sections, using a tool to really cram it in there. Once I added milliput to both halves and pressed them together, the mold fit super well thanks to those flat areas and the overlap it created. I did my best to squish out any extra material and left it to cure. Once dried, I again noticed that there was a bunch of extra material, kind of looking like a rat pancake, but overall it's looking pretty good. Upon moving the rat, I had the tail break as I flexed the mold too much, but it's nothing a little superglue couldn't fix. This was my reminder to be super careful about removing that really recessed leg and try to really pry that part of the mold open without disturbing the rest of the rat. Luckily, the mold is pretty flexible even when cooled, and I managed to get him out. After carefully removing all the extra milliput with my X-Acto knife and repairing the tail, I was really excited with how this came out, especially with how well the detail was captured. His little rat face was really crisp, and I'm also pleased with the legs, even though they did take a little bit of cleanup. I wanted to try again though, this time attempting to use a more accurate amount of milliput and get a better result. I used the end of a paintbrush to help wedge the milliput into the mold, but also scrape away any excess material, trying to get a perfect flattened imprint in each of the mold halves. The tail is kind of tricky since it's such a thin part, so I was a little lenient as I didn't want to get too little in there and have it be fragile or have gaps. On my first rat molds, I left them to cure overnight, so they were pretty solid and a little brittle. On these guys, I went with around 3 to 4 hours. I found that it was still pretty flexible, allowing me to get them out with less damage this time. I still surprisingly had a rat pancake on my hands though, with too much material added. But at the end of the day, I'd rather have to do some cleanup work over not having enough material in there. All the extra crumbles away pretty easily, with only the area around the legs needing some more serious cleanup. I also thought leaving these guys on the sprue would help with the molding process, but really I wish I just did a thorough job cleaning them up and removed all the mold lines and stuff before making the molds, as you can kind of see on the tail end how that bit of sprue left a weird contact point. And I was a little too nervous to clean it as thoroughly as I would have liked if it was something like plastic. You can also kind of see where the two halves meet. There's a bit of extra material. I thought this ridge running down their back was due to extra milliput, but after examining the original model, I think it can be blamed on just overall weirdness of the sculpt. I think the detail the Oyumaru can capture is pretty amazing though, and where the mold went well, it's a pretty perfect replica of my original models, even doing a great job of capturing the finer detail on the small rats. I also couldn't manage to clean up the cattails well enough. I think it's just too fine of a bit, and every time I tried to get some of that extra milliput off, I ended up with a major break. I think a model with a little more chunk to it is better suited for this process. I also think something like green stuff would be a better casting material, as it's a bit more flexible than milliput, which can actually be a little brittle. But no model's complete without some paint, so let's check out how I finished up these rats. For all of my regular rats in my Skaven army, like clan rats, I start with an overall coat of dried bark over a black primer, making sure I get it into all those nice fur details. For the skin or areas without fur like the legs and face, I mix in some orange brown into the dried bark in about a 2-to-1 ratio, and then highlight those same sections with pure orange brown, picking out some of the details and adding prominence. For their fur sections, I add some white into dried bark and give them a dry brush, which those older sculpted fur details take super well. Warlord purple is then added to a dried bark and white mix, all in equal parts. I use this color to dry brush the tail, giving it a pink tint. I then add a little more white and use a regular brush to pick out some of those segmented tail details and create a highlight. When it comes to swarms of things, a little variety is nice, and I like to paint my more martial rats like storm vermin a really dark, almost black gray. I start with NATO black for the base coat, making sure I get it all over the black primer. From here I add white and dry brush it all over the rats, picking up all the fur and other details. Then I add even more white and hit just the face and legs, helping them stand out. I then use the same color to pick out all the facial details with my regular brush. Since they're looking kind of samey, I mix a smidge of Warlord purple into that same mix and dry brush it over their tails, helping to differentiate them and also put a little bit on their noses. All the rats' eyes are carefully picked out with Warlord purple, while their teeth are roughly a 50-50 mix of Zemezi Desert and white, giving them a grimy look and adding a lot of detail. Using a small fine brush like this means that the paint gets kind of dry quickly, but I've found this can help work as a tiny dry brush if you're finding those tiny details like this hard to pick out. Just go super slow. The last detail to pick out is all the metal bits on the larger rats. I use Retributor armor to add a fun splash of color, and then mix some orange brown and NATO black left over on my palette to give some shading and definition to the metal. It's a pretty quick paint job, but I think it's super suitable for giant rats and looks pretty nice. You can even replicate this for any other model in your Skaven army. I'm really stoked about how well these molds worked out. I'm actually really excited to maybe try them out on the new Skaven kits in 4th, but really it's up to you if it's worth the hassle compared to just buying a regular kit. I think it's great at duplicating something that you might only get a couple of, and it's really easy to make little objective markers or unit fillers out of cloned bits. I also especially appreciate it for these giant rats as they're super old, and as of right now they're not readily available to purchase on the Warhammer store. These were actually some of my first Skaven models, and I'm really excited that I can just make copies of them to paint and play with without messing up the originals. I'm probably overly sentimental, but I also think it's just a super cool way to clone some of your favorite Warhammer bits, and I'm really excited to see how far I can stretch this. I hope this showed you how easy and fun it is to make your own molds and start duplicating your own stuff. Thanks for watching.